Hello everybody, look at the Scottish rapper here. Cultural terrorism with a big splash of self-regard. And I just want to share some thoughts, having just had a very long and interesting conversation with a pal of mine. And we covered lots of different topics as we often do. And before that I was out with some other friends. And it just got the wheels turning a little bit, and it struck me that having been considering a lot of these issues around what you call identity politics for quite a long time, and really grappling with not just what they mean, but what they mean for me, and speaking on things and then having my point of view modified or corrected in some way as a result of having spoken or having misspoken. Thankfully I have the right to misspeak, and that's a really necessary function of free speech. But ultimately, that due to my commitment to social justice and due to my sense of solidarity with feminists, people of colour, people in the LGBTQ community, people who have disabilities or face challenges in relation to their learning needs, anybody that you care to mention in the society that we have created who suffers discrimination, oppression, victimisation as a direct result of aspects of their identity that are out with their control, that this society is either grudgingly accommodating or refusing to accommodate, then I feel a solidarity with them. And if I'm not cognizant of a particular struggle, I try to make myself aware of it and become more conscious of it and integrate that into my understanding. But in the last year, I've been thinking out loud about some of my own deeply held beliefs. And this was as a result of going through the Scottish independence referendum, where I had a very set worldview, and it was challenged and fractured in many ways by how the result went and how things played out after that. I thought we were going to win independence. I thought the independence movement was based on social justice, was based on radically redesigning our society and radically reinterpreting what those tenets even mean. So I bought into a version of life where I was one of the good guys, and that my intentions were always noble, and that my worldview and my aspirations ideologically should be achieved by any means necessary. All that went out the window after a no vote, because I had to consider to myself, if I was wrong about that, then what else am I wrong about? And I started sharing those thoughts with groups in the Yes movement. I would perform and I would speak on these things and I would think out loud. And then I started feeling a resistance, because my message changed from everybody should vote yes and we're great to are we great? Look at some of the people who voted no and look at some of the reasons why they voted no, and are all Tory scum. And speaking out loud about these things, actually the tone and how people started to react to me changed. So I started to feel pushback. And this kind of set up an ongoing conflict, at least in my life. I know what I do is of no significance to anybody else, but this has been a journey, the culmination of which has been my trigger warning project, which exists on vlogs, which exists in music, which exists in essays, which exists as a kind of like a living testament, captured in as many mediums as possible, of a person really deeply challenging their own beliefs, thinking out loud, being wrong, making an arse of themselves, but at all times trying to be transparent as much as is humanly possible. And that brings me to today, where I seem to have been able to string together disparate aspects of my thinking into some sort of coherent structure that I might be able to articulate to you. So as much as I've been critical of the left and critical of the radical left and critical of identity politics, it's only out of a curiosity which begins and ends with me in terms of questioning on a quite a deep level. Have some of my ideological assumptions throughout my life been based on my own biases and prejudices? So the fact that I identify for most of my life as a kind of lefty, as a socialist, that doesn't require any great effort. I was born into a community where that was the norm. So that was my first ideological parking space. And the reason that it was such a comfortable fit is because it was an ideological parking space that required me to do almost nothing. Not only does the theory of class describe why I am where I am, but it also describes why I feel the way that I feel, and it legitimises any resentments that I have, and in many ways articulates those resentments as political theories. So my big beef was always middle class this and middle class that, and I still harbour so much resentment for things and people that in my mind I automatically designate as stereotypically middle class. And this isn't a healthy way to think, and this isn't a sensible way for me to behave, but according to that reading of society, it absolutely is. And it's legitimate, and me talking shit about middle class people is punching up, and middle class people aren't people, but they're part of a structural oppression that's taking place. And so actually the amount of energy that I'm using just to resent a lot of people under the false pretense that I'm pushing back against some force is not just self-deluded in a lot of ways, but energetically inefficient. And so I began to realise that maybe that wasn't a final destination for me ideologically. Maybe it was a stepping stone to something else. Of course, when I started thinking out loud about this stuff, then I just came into conflict with people. And I started to realise actually that the community that I'm part of, while obviously kind of like identifying itself as progressive, as liberal, as forward-thinking, and as creative, at the same time, increasingly there's a totalitarian kind of undercurrent to how things are discussed, and that's not a term that I use. That's a term that I've seen other people on the left use to describe the current identity politics, and not necessarily the analysis, but the activism and the discourse that it's becoming synonymous with. So I need to make clear right now that my criticism of certain aspects of identity politics, and I'm sure I speak for other people who are critical of it as well, should never ever be conflated with a denial that oppressions exist, a denial that women face a whole multitude of cultural, structural, political, interpersonal oppressions, victimizations, transgressions, things that I could never even perceive from my position as a white male, as a man, as someone who's never experienced life from that angle. Criticism of certain aspects of identity politics should never be conflated with a denial that racism exists and that people experience persecution in all the same ways as women do, but as a result of their race or their gender identity or their religious expression, and so on and so forth. And I think that this is where people like me have went wrong with a criticism of identity politics. It's important, if we're going to criticise identity politics, that we acknowledge why it exists. Because regardless of the fact that there are some aspects of it, and I'll go into this in a wee bit, there are some aspects of it that we find unhelpful, that undermine the long-term goals, that are illiberal in some way. At the same time, the passionate advocates of identity politics, the university-educated kind of liberals that annoy us, the kind of strident activists who seem as motivated by their own prejudices as any of the misogynists that they go against, those wee pockets, regardless of that, this is still the only movement that is not only attempting to articulate a version of society that includes everyone, but is actively moving forward, trying to set out what that looks like, in spite of criticism from the left, and in spite of being embattled by pretty much everybody else on the spectrum, whatever way you slice it. And so this is something that we need to integrate into a critique of identity politics, is that it exists for a reason, and that people of colour, women, and all other minority groups, individuals, while they might actually, just like me, be able to see some of the excesses of it, it's the only thing that exists that attempts to include them, represent them, speak for them. And while there are a lot of aspects to it which are problematic, what are the alternatives? When I'm critiquing identity politics, I now see that that could be misinterpreted or misunderstood as a denial that it should exist in the first place. If I'm not making sure that I'm constantly articulating that it exists because people are underrepresented, people's struggles aren't articulated, and this is often based on race and gender in that analysis, then actually it just looks like I'm trying to dismantle identity politics if I'm not constantly reiterating that. So I feel like that's an area of thought within me as a person really grappling with this stuff as an individual in a society that's very confusing. And it's something that I've arrived at through considering it deeply, including people that have challenged me, including people that have called me out, when it would have been a lot easier to just bin the whole thing and say fuck you and fuck everybody. In reality, I can't divorce myself from social justice. I can't divorce myself from identity politics, because I believe something has to exist that attempts to not only pay lip service to inclusion, but attempts to lay down the tracks in front of the train as we move towards a more diverse society. Now, the thing about diversity is that it's become a sacred concept on the left and with social justice, except for diversity of opinion. That is something that needs to change. So there are aspects of identity politics that we need to be able to discuss while recognising why it exists, while making sure that a broad range of voices are included, and people like me recognising when it's time to sit down and shut up and show solidarity, unquestioning. There are times when that should be the case. Now, first of all, identity, again, like diversity, is a sacred concept, but actually identity, regardless of what we might be telling people, identity isn't just what you decide it is. It's something that's negotiated between you, between other people in society, between institutions and culture generally. And so it's misleading to place a person's personal expression of identity, i.e. how they see themselves, as sacred, as something that reality is calibrated around. And ultimately, there should be scope for other ideas about identity to be discussed without people who've integrated debatable ideas into their identity who then feel attacked because people want to debate ideas about identity. This is something about identity politics and social justice that we need to create space to discuss. Now, it might be too late for some activists who have internalised a lot of the theories and sense of urgency that they feel about feeling completely ideologically embattled and oppressed and triggered. It might be too late for some of them, and it might not be worth energy actually fighting them and arguing with them. It might just be best to let them go and do them in whatever way they see fit. But as for the next generation of people coming through, activists, people in communities, we have to go a step further in terms of engaging them and not only pander to their angers and pander to what they think is unfair. We have to develop a process where we reflect on why we're angry and that we develop an emotional literacy about what motivates us to take positions. Because I don't know about you, but a lot of my politics are based on resentment and are based on misguided resentments, based on an ideological reading when I look at the world through one lens. And because I always look at it through that lens, I begin to think that all of life, that this is the key to understanding all of life, that class struggle was the key to understanding all of life. That might be the case, but someone else should be able to dispute that and not be committing a microaggression against me and not denying my right to exist. And I think that these are some of the excesses on the left that people are afraid to speak up about because everyone wants to be regarded as an ally. What kind of ally are we when we're co-signing bullshit? What kind of ally are we when we're setting up a scenario where lots of women and lots of people of colour and lots of white males are talking to each other behind the scenes about the things that are difficult, about the challenges they face, expressing how they feel or how they see things within this movement because they're afraid to draw the fire of the most extreme elements who will call you out online and invite third parties to take part in social media based gossip, who will feel completely justified to hold up one microaggression as part of a massive structure of microaggressions and treat you like a perpetrator of abuse, when in actual fact you might just be a person speaking out of ignorance. You might just be a person arriving at a dumb conclusion because you haven't thought it through. And that ultimately this vociferous form of activism, it doesn't create a culture of inclusion, but actually a culture of fear that's not dissimilar to the very cultures of oppression and abuse that we're trying to fight against. And that means creating a culture of self-reflection. So many people that I've come into conflict with are clearly coming from their own place of trauma. They truly believed that something I said was so dangerous that I had to be hounded, that I had to be challenged in such a way that brings my personal and professional reputation into disrepute. Now, even though that was difficult and is difficult, I still feel solidarity with them. I still feel like they must have a reading of society that is so urgent that merely words coming out of my mouth are a form of violence that needs to be condemned, that needs to be challenged. Sometimes that might be the case, but sometimes it isn't. And sometimes the culture of activism that accompanies social justice in its current strain and this form of identity politics with which it's becoming synonymous, that needs to be challenged as well. And currently, we don't have the balls to challenge it. People don't have the guts to challenge it. Not men, not feminists, not people of colour. It's not going to come for someone like me. It's not going to be successful if somebody like me does it. Fuck's sake, look already at the commotion caused just for thinking out loud. So it seems to me that this is about creating a space where we can at least discuss some of the excesses. Because some of the analysis, intersectional analysis, privilege theory, it produces as much confusion as it resolves, and it only works when you have a social justice activist sitting beside you to explain the way that you're interpreting it is actually wrong, and that's not practical. Most people will recoil at the theories being superimposed upon them because they won't regard themselves as privileged. They won't regard themselves as part of a privileged class. And they will do the same thing that all of the social justice activists do, and all of the minority groups and abuse victims that they claim to represent will do. And they will home in on their personal experience, and that will become the most important thing for them, and that will be the thing around which their reality calibrates. And who's to say that their personal experience is not as important as these other personal experiences? Who decides which personal experience enters the pantheon of gospel and which ones get minimised and monstered? Now, finally, the last thing that I want to say is that that a lot of the time people will say that class struggle is no longer the struggle, and that by privileging that above other forms of oppression, then you conceal subcultures of oppression that affect women, people based on their ethnicity, and so on and so forth, like I've just described. And that the only alternative to this form of identity politics is a return to the kind of macho left of the 20th century. And that form of class politics didn't work because of all the people it alienated. Now, this was in an essay that I read by Henry Bell, which I thought was a good essay. But if he's using alienation as a measurement by which we decide if a form of politics or discourse is relevant, then surely this current strain of identity politics alienates more people. Not only alienates people, but encourages the people that it does engage to home in on their individual grievance, to home in on their individual oppressions, and that it becomes taboo to even mention class in certain instances. So while I recognise that we have to broaden the discussion beyond just class, it seems to me that there is still a place for class to be creating some sort of cohesion in terms of knowing where we're different and knowing where we're the same. And ultimately, this form of identity politics has the full endorsement of all of the corporate and capitalist institutions in the Anglosphere. And I include Apple, Pfizer, Microsoft, as well as institutions, universities, liberal institutions, media. This analysis, this leftist analysis, is culturally dominating. All these other movements are a counterculture to it. And so, while we might think that intersectionality is the next step of socialism, you have to wonder why MTV and Microsoft and Pfizer and Apple are willing to actually step in and threaten to pull business out of American states if they don't change the laws around discrimination against LGBTQ groups. This is the role corporations should play, but they never play that role. And you have to ask, why are they now stepping in on behalf of their employees, their consumers, to influence legislatures against putting forward laws that would legalise discrimination against minorities? And go and look it up. You have to ask, why would multinational companies do that? Is it because they see this particular form of identity politics as safe, as something that's not an existential threat, as opposed to class? Because I don't remember those big companies jumping in and defending workers' rights and defending anything to do with workers. So this form of identity politics is the full endorsement of corporate America, and there's something in that needs to be analysed as well. I know this is a long one, folks, just a bit of a thought bomb that hit me. But ultimately, I feel like as a person on the left, as a person with a voice, albeit a very small voice in a very small fucking corner of the world, I feel like I need to give this one more chance, one more pass at it, in recognition that previous passes based on my own inexperience, on my own inability to articulate what I was thinking or feeling, at my own prejudices being laid bare at my own stupidity and at my own genuine curiosity, to be perfectly frank. It takes a lot more energy to do what I'm doing than it does just to stay where you were when you first got interested in politics, where you were born. But at the same time, while I see a lot of people like that, fuck this, I'm off. I'm off to a new ideological plantation. This is pish. I don't feel like I'm ready to do that yet. I feel like there is a way to articulate a critique of identity politics which also recognises both why it exists and why certain aspects of it work well, have worked well, and should be extended. It's simply about the accompanying activism at times and discourse, which I feel is illiberal, is heavy-handed, is unforgiving, and makes no account not only of the reality of how people think, speak and communicate, but also the emotional experience that everyone is having and how it feels to have a theory superimposed onto you and you be accused of perpetrating oppression or microaggression if you question that theory. That is the stuff about identity politics that needs to be challenged. Anything else? Trigger warning, the album. Look out January sometime for some things. The album is my attempt to express a lot of these ideas artistically. And so it'd be cool if you checked it out. And apart from that, I think I'll just leave it there. What do you think?